Hello. In 1990, MB Games and Games Workshop would release a follow-up to their smash hit family dungeon crawling board game, HeroQuest. It would be set in the 41st millennium and would draw on the lore of 40k, the gameplay of Space Hulk, and all of the lessons learned from that fantasy questing. Though it isn't as successful or as famous as its predecessor, this game would change the lives of many young gamers, me included. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're charting a course for the ultimate encounter as we explore the history of Space Crusade. I remember Space Crusade, and I don't mean like a passing acquaintance you could say hello to in the street. I mean like a childhood best friend who helped shape my worldview. Like HeroQuest before it, it made its way into the sorcery household before I was old enough to really understand what it was. My older brothers received both games for Christmas, and after deciding that they were more complicated than Sabutio, they passed them on to me. It would be years before I could play the game properly or even understand the universes that the games were set in. But those little hopping Gretchen, incredible Chaos Space Marines, and that mighty, mighty Dreadnought just left me with hours and hours of indelible memories. And whilst we talk about memories, please remember to leave a like if you enjoy this video. But what even is a Space Crusade? And why is it also a Star Quest? How did this game come to exist? And more importantly, how did I get my grubby mitts on it? Why don't you and me take a little look? Space Crusade is a tabletop board game set in Games Workshop's 40k universe. In it, up to 3 players take on the roles of the Adeptus Astartes, commanding a squad of tactical space marines from one of the Blood Angels, Imperial Fists and Ultramarines chapters. The final player takes on the role of the Aliens, the inhabitants of the dangerous Space Hulk, ranging from Space Orcs and their put-upon Gretchen sidekicks, formidable Chaos Androids, vile Chaos Space Marines, and the nigh unstoppable Chaos Dreadnoughts. Through a series of missions, the Marines would seek to complete objectives on the multi-part game board, whilst the alien commander tried to stop them. To call it the Sci-Fi HeroQuest does a disservice to the creativity and care that can be found in this game. But to summarise, it's a Sci-Fi HeroQuest, and that is, in part, how it came to exist in the first place. In the late 80s, a representative of Milton Bradley Games was on the hunt for new components. Milton Bradley, or MB, were an American board games manufacturer, founded in 1860. The eponymous founder, Milton Bradley, had initially been a lithograph maker, producing photographic prints of famous individuals. He had had a good run with a lithograph of then little-known presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln, but his fortunes ran out as soon as Lincoln decided to grow his famous beard. In the picture, he was clean-shaven, and people wanted their money back. After playing an imported board game, Bradley thought an American version could do well, and so in the winter of 1860, the Milton Bradley Company released The Checkered Game of Life. 100 years later, that game would get a second edition, The Game of Life, and the Milton Bradley Company would still be going strong, releasing classic board games like Battleship, Axis and Allies, and Buckaroo. By the late 80s, MB were looking to branch out into a new type of game, and so they called the foundling hobby shop and UK game developer Games Workshop. The phone that rang belonged to the London Games Workshop store on Dorling Road, and the person that answered it was the store manager, Stephen Baker. Baker had joined Games Workshop working weekends after finishing college. As soon as he could, he went full-time at the Dorling Road store and quickly worked his way up to manager. When MB called to inquire about game components, Baker was more than happy to help, and some long conversations and playtesting soon turned into a job offer. Stephen Baker became an associate game designer at MB. Baker has been a stalwart at MB and its subsequent form as part of Hasbro, working with them off and on for the past 35 years. And producing an enormous range of games, including Heroescape, Havoc, and the recently released Dragonlance Warriors of Krynn. Perhaps most importantly, in his time there, he would build a collaborative relationship with Games Workshop that allowed MB to produce board games loosely set in the worlds of Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000, and most importantly, used Citadel miniatures and characters. HeroQuest, Battlemasters, and of course Space Crusade would be innovative products that introduced a generation to high fantasy gaming, Space Marines, and the dread forces of chaos. More importantly, they would take these kinds of games from back rooms and basements onto the kitchen table. For a time, miniature gaming would be mainstream. HeroQuest had been an enormous success in 1989. It had sold more than 126,000 copies, and a range of expansions had been released to capitalise on that success. MB Games were keen to see if they could repeat the triumph, and Stephen Baker, collaborating with Jervis Johnson at Games Workshop, thought that the natural next step would be to release a sci-fi sequel. And what better sci-fi setting than the emerging universe taking shape at Games Workshop itself, the 40k universe. It was still a few years until the more formalised second edition of 40k would be released, but the wilder fringes of Rogue Trader were already beginning to get grounded a little, and the 1989 game Space Hulk had proven that the confines of a dangerous and unexplored hunk of space debris and rock could provide the perfect setting for sci-fi dungeon crawling. And, at the same time, the Space Marines themselves had achieved arguably their most iconic and enduring look, Mark VII power armour. The Marines included in Space Crusade were not the first plastic Marines released, but they did feature push-fit weapons that could be changed between missions, and they came in coloured plastic to distinguish between the blue Ultramarines, red Blood Angels, and yellow Imperial Fist squads. Other emerging favourites like Orcs, Gretchins, Gene Stealers, and Chaos Marines were also included in the game, filling the roles that their fantasy analogues Orcs, Goblins, Fimir, I guess, and the Chaos Warriors played in HeroQuest. With the help of James Cameron's The Terminator, the Quest skeleton became the Chaos Android, and the big bad boss guy, the Gargoyle, was replaced with the Chaos Dreadnought, a mighty robotic foe with cinematic roots of its own. In designing the game, Baker wanted to ensure that there was more for the bad guy player to do, and that they didn't just end up as a passive secret keeper waiting for the other players to take their actions. And there were other lessons he had learned from HeroQuest 2, like the increased flexibility of that multi-part board and the hidden movement of enemy models that would maintain balance between the opposing sides. Because of that direct relationship between HeroQuest and Space Crusade, it can be hard to consider it on its own merits. The shadow of its sibling is long. But there were other factors that limited the long-term success of Space Crusade, and why it's perhaps not as well known today as its fantasy equivalent. In a surprising choice, Space Crusade did not receive a release in North America by MB Games, closing off a huge potential market. And in several European markets like Belgium, the Netherlands and Italy, the game was rebranded as StarQuest, presumably to more closely resemble its ancestor. The German edition, also called StarQuest, featured a few lore changes in order to tone down the violence inherent in the game. The enemies were all robots and synthetic life forms, and the guns didn't kill anyone. They just captured them in time warps and moved them between dimensions. And yes, I bet being slingshot into another dimension is totally non-traumatic and in no way violent. The game comes with 2 books, a rulebook and a mission book. Throughout the rulebook, there is an ongoing story about a marine mission into the Space Hulk, featuring art by Manhar Chauhan, who had previously worked at the Jim Henson Company designing creatures for Fraggle Rock and the Muppets. This comic strip really sets the tone for the 40k universe and the game of Space Crusade. It basically channels the movie Aliens as a team of Space Marines embark on a gung-ho mission, encounter more aliens than they expected, and then get completely vaporized by a dreadnought. Chauhan also provided art for some of the other components and cards in the game, including the 3D control panels. The mission book features more art from Chauhan, including another wonderful image of an Imperial Gothic battleship, a design that would become a miniature in its own right with the release of Space Fleet the following year. There is also some introductory lore from the 40k universe, introducing concepts like the Imperium, Warp, and the various equipment that make up the standard Space Marine kit. The book also features campaign rules that allow the Marine and Alien players to build experience through successful missions, and to elevate their forces ahead of the next game. In the base game, there were 12 missions. These were built around a primary objective that all of the Marine players would be racing to complete first, along with a secondary objective that could also be claimed. If the Marines fail to complete these objectives, then the Alien player wins them, and continues on their journey to becoming a Lord of Chaos. The game is played on a combination of 4 square board tiles that can be laid in multiple configurations to produce the game map for that mission. A 3D wall feature is then placed across the centre of the map, along with a number of freestanding doors and bulkheads. To show the movement of the alien forces, but not reveal exactly what they are comprised of, the game borrows another idea from the Space Hulk playbook, using blip tokens. One side is a generic token back that reveals nothing, but flip it over and you can see if it is just a couple of relatively harmless Gretchen or some very harmful Chaos Marines with big melty guns. There are an absolute ton of other tokens and beautifully illustrated cards in the game too, as well as 3D scanners for the Marine players and a control panel for the Alien player that allow them to track game and campaign progress. The cover of Space Crusade was illustrated by Jim Burns, who continues to produce fantasy and sci-fi themed art for album covers to this day. It is an epic piece, very much in keeping with the Marine art of the era. In particular, it reminds me of the Space Marine box cover, you know, the one that wants you to say hi to its little friend. But my favourite version of the Space Crusade box came with the reprinted version that featured a new cover by David Squee. Apart from the art change, there don't appear to be any other amendments between these editions. Squee is perhaps most famous for his work on the football comics Roy of the Rovers and Scorer, but for me, this is his most impressive work. Outstanding stuff. The back of the Space Crusade box depicts a group of kids playing the game in the midst of an actual Space Hulk. This is a graphic device that I would love to see make a comeback. They did the same thing for HeroQuest and Battle Masters, and I think it is great. The approach was also used in the incredible advert that ran on UK TV for Space Crusade.
Space Crusade takes you into warp space to fight the force of chaos. The ultimate encounter is here.
Still one of the best TV adverts ever made, especially for this kind of game. It's something about playing in just the most terrifying and ridiculous environment, like a Space Hulk or a dungeon or a battlefield. It just kind of, I don't know, it's fun, I guess. The enemies of Space Crusade have largely remained in the 40k universe, but there are a couple of interesting exceptions. In the game, the Chaos Androids were detailed as being the creation of Chaos Squats. But for the androids, it would be almost a decade before they would get a proper bit of lore in the 40k universe. First appearing in the 3rd edition core rulebook as an unknown form of dangerous Xenos, and then in the flesh, so to speak, when the Necrons were released in 1998. Just as the Chaos Android wore its Terminator inspiration pretty plainly, the first Necrons would feature reanimation protocols with a more familiar name as well. The rule was called We'll Be Back. And then there is the strange case of the Chaos Dreadnought. The Chaos Dreadnoughts detailed in early 40k don't particularly resemble the current iteration, but they are also quite different to the model from Space Crusade. Very clearly influenced by the design of cop robot Ed 209 in the 1987 movie RoboCop, and who could blame them? It's an awesome and intimidating design. This Dreadnought was never made available as a 40k release, but it did make its way onto the battlefields of Epic. There were a couple of releases for Space Crusade beyond the base game, including expansions and articles in Games Workshop's magazine White Dwarf. The first expansion was Mission Dreadnought, and it really made you think, is the plural of Dreadnought Dreadnought, or Dreadnoughts? Or Dreadno? Taking place during the assault on Blood 6, the Mission Dreadnought expansion delivers a whole lot of new Dreadnought options for the aliens and the heavy weaponry that will let the Space Marine players actually stop them. The Marine players get access to 6 additional Marines and 9 extra heavy weapons. They also get to use the Tarantula mobile support weapons. Much like seeing the RoboCop baddie walking the game boards in the form of that Dreadnought, seeing what felt very much like the sentry guns from Aliens in the game was another perfect cinematic moment for my younger self. These guns could be moved around the board and set up to provide very heavy covering fire. In time, Forge World would release updated variations of the Tarantula weapons platforms for use by Marine and Imperial Guard forces in 40k. The pack also came with a new board section, a Dreadnought Factory, which had its own 3D wall. There were only 3 new missions in the Mission Dreadnought box, but they were not easy, especially the final one, which would see a near endless supply of Dreadnoughts being produced in the factory. And there was one more inclusion in the pack that spiced things up. Along with some extra androids, the alien player got another regular Dreadnought and a heavy Dreadnought. Using the various parts of these 2 new Dreadnought miniatures, it was actually possible to make one of 4 Dreadnought configurations, and they were all completely nails. The second expansion pack was Eldar Attack. This one is a really fun idea, allowing one player to take on the role of an Eldar strike squad entering the Space Hulk. There were 10 miniatures in this pack, 1 Eldar Exarch and 9 warriors, along with a range of weapons and tokens. There was also a new small board section and plenty of new game cards. The Eldar used different weapons and equipment to the Space Marines, and also possessed the ability to use psychic powers. The new mission book also included 4 new missions built around this new Eldar squad. By using the Eldar force, it also became possible to run the game with a total of 5 players, 3 Marine, 1 Eldar, and 1 Alien. Though it is largely unrelated, I thought it was fun to discover that veteran GW artist Jeff Taylor would later produce another piece of art with the name Eldar Attack, a piece that would go on to be the cover art for the 2nd edition codex. Over the years, I've been fortunate enough to play a lot of Space Crusade, and my friend Rob even had Eldar Attack and Mission Dreadnought in his collection. We played plenty of Mission Dreadnought, but we never actually got Eldar Attack onto the gaming table, so I've never experienced any of the Eldar rules. One thing I have read though, is that there's a psychic power that allows a player to pick up and rotate one of the board sections, and I can only imagine that there were lots of kids who maybe got a bit too enthusiastic, and with the centrifugal force of a Graviton amusement ride, rocketed Gretchen to every wall in the room. White Dwarf magazine offered additional rules for use in Space Crusade. In issue 134, released in February 1991, there were new options to include a host of new miniatures in the game. Jervis Johnson provided rules for replacing the standard Marine squads with those of Space Marine Scouts, Space Marine Terminators, or even mobs of Orcs. Meanwhile, the Alien player got access to Genestealer hybrids and Mighty Tyranid warriors. In January of the following year, White Dwarf 145 would offer up a new set of missions that could be linked in a mini-campaign. Written by Andrew Kennedy Skipton, this 5-part campaign followed the Marine players attempting to recover a missing Mechanicus agent who had developed an anti-gene that protected against Genestealer infection. New rules were included for Space Marine librarians and a range of psychic powers. There were also rules and cutout tokens to simulate debris cluttering up the space station corridors. These tokens were actually repurposed from Space Hulk 1st edition. That was the extent of content produced for the original Space Crusade game, but MB did have some final products in mind as well. They produced a set of jigsaw puzzles that recreated the box art from the Space Crusade base game, as well as Mission Dreadnought. I would assume Eldar Attack also got the puzzle piece treatment, but I've not been able to confirm that yet. Having conquered European gaming tables and jigsaw puzzler conventions, Space Crusade next set its sights on the most technologically advanced platform ever conceived by mankind, the ZX Spectrum. In 1992, Gremlin Interactive, who also made the HeroQuest adaptation, released the Space Crusade video game on a range of platforms, including Amiga, Amstrad, Atari, Commodore 64, and MS-DOS. The turn-based strategy game faithfully replicated the board game and received positive buzz. Your Sinclair magazine readers even voted it number 24 in their top 100 games of all time. Take that, Saboteur 2. As with the tabletop game, there would be an expansion pack for the video game as well, with The Voyage Beyond getting a release later in 1992. However, only Amiga and Atari players would be able to play it. Your Sinclair readers were furious. Just as Games Workshop had followed up on their earlier collaboration with MB Games by releasing Advanced HeroQuest, they would again look to release a largely unconnected sequel. In this case, Advanced Space Crusade, released later in 1990. The game was designed by Simon Forrest, a contributor to many Warhammer Fantasy roleplay books, and Jervis Johnson, a linchpin of GW game design for 30 years. The game moved the action away from the desolate hulks of the spaces Hulk and Crusade, instead favouring the interior corridors, arteries and organs of bio-organic living Tyranid hive ships. Conceptually, I think that this is amazing. Moving the action away from those mechanical and technological environments that we've spent so much time in Space Crusade and Space Hulk, and towards something that's just completely alien and monstrous and totally the opposite by putting us inside this alien creature, I think that's a fantastic idea. Sadly, for me, the visuals just aren't as interesting or, I guess, attractive as I would hope that they would be. I don't think it was ever going to be a visually appealing backdrop, given it's, inside a massive alien, but I don't think the bright neon colours or repetitive shapes really hold up to more than a few minutes of scrutiny. And when you're supposed to be amongst them for mission after mission, they are very tiring to look at. More successful was the idea that these missions are being undertaken by Space Marine scouts, a less experienced but more dynamic force of explorers, and your main enemy was not Gene Stealers or Chaos Forces, but Tyranid warriors. And the objectives for these missions are to surgically destroy the internal organs of those living hive ships. The rules allow for the inclusion of a wide array of Marine and Tyranid forces depending on your collection, and the complexity of the rules and the campaign have been cited as making the game an interesting playthrough. There were also a series of articles in White Dwarf that added even more options. In December 1990's White Dwarf 132, there were new rules for using Imperial Guard boarding parties. The February 1991 issue, 134, which included the Space Crusade rules for using your Advanced Space Crusade Scouts and Tyranid warriors, also included rules for using Orc squads in the advanced game. Plus, it came with a new board section for you to expand the hive ship. I briefly owned a copy of Advanced Space Crusade and played it a couple of times, and the actual setting, it really is super interesting. It's a really cool approach. It's something completely different and new. But ultimately, I just didn't enjoy the game as much as Space Crusade or Space Hulk. So I moved on from it quite quickly. I think now, in retrospect, I would love to give it another go. After the end of the MB collaboration, Games Workshop lost the rights to the Space Crusade name, and they revisited the contents of Advanced Space Crusade with a new box game released in 1992, Tyranid Attack. Again designed by Jervis Johnson, despite looking the same, Tyranid Attack was not just a rebranded Advanced Space Crusade. Instead, it was a simpler game that used the same scouts and Tyranid warriors, but also included Space Marines and Terminator armor, Terminator librarians, Gene Stealers, and Gene Stealer hybrids. It was designed to play fast and fun, and a lot of the complexity of the earlier game was scaled back. A couple of White Dwarf issues, 159 and 162, would allow for extra miniatures to be used in the games. 159 introduced rules for Eldar in Tyranid Attack, sort of an Eldar Attack, Tyranid Attack, and 162 allowed the use of Space Marine, Chaos Marine, Eldar and Orc Dreadnoughts. And for the Tyranids, the Screamer Killer Carnifex could join the fray as well. A sad footnote in the story of Space Crusade was precisely due to those rights issues that came about from the end of the collaboration between MB and Games Workshop. Around 2016, the rights to the Space Crusade name found their way into the hands of games company Prodos, and they announced that they were working on a brand new version of Space Crusade with all new miniatures and an all new setting. They were going to launch it via Kickstarter or a similar crowdfunding platform, and it was apparently going to be everything you could wish for. Great, you might think. As a fan of Space Crusade, you would be looking forward to seeing this brand new iteration of this classic game. Well, you would be, unless it looks like this. Prodos intended to release a range of heavily sexualized armored space warriors, which may well be what some gamers are looking for, but it's really not my cup of Crusade. There followed something of a backlash against these design choices, and ultimately, the news of the new game started to peter out. It never made it to shelves. Prodos did go ahead with a range of Space Crusader miniatures that included some of these sexy space warriors, as well as the grotesque space demons, but as far as I know, that was the extent of the range. If you focus only on the rights issues and the sexy Space Marine knockoff miniatures, you might think that the Space Crusade name has fallen to ruin. There's not much discussion of the game online, there's no fan campaign looking for a reissue, Hasbro are not prepping a shiny, exciting reboot. But I prefer to look at the game's greater legacy. This was my first experience of Space Marines, of Grotty Gretchen, of sci-fi elf Eldars, of the perennial favourite, the Gene Stealer. These were my first steps into the 40k universe. This game showed me how the films that I love could inspire the games that I would come to love. And it offered a way of merging all of those influences together into an incredible experience. In many ways, when I play Blackstone Fortress or Space Hulk today, I'm still playing Space Crusade. I guess the real Space Crusade was in here all along. or at least something that makes more sense and really does speak to how important this game was to my complete career journey in games. And besides, if we didn't have Space Crusade, we might never have had Necrons. If you have enjoyed this look into the history of Space Crusade, please feel free to leave a like, to share, to subscribe. And if you've got any memories of Space Crusade that you would like to tell me about, then please leave a comment below. And if you've thought of any games that you would love for me to take a look at, I would love to hear from you as well. I'm always looking for new projects, and there's so many great games that I could spend all this time researching. It's just so interesting to me. Thank you very much for watching. I am Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. If you're asking me if I've ever thought about crossing over Space Crusade, Space Hulk, Blackstone Fortress, and Assassinorum Execution Force, then I would say to you that that's the work of a madman. And if you're a member of the Administratum, then you legally have to tell me. But, you know, I've thought about it.